5 prisoners were kept awake for 15 days by Russian researchers using a gas-based stimulant no one had ever tested before. It took place inside of a sealed chamber, part of a study only known as the Russian sleep experiment. You all asked me to talk about creepypastas, so that's what we're doing today, and this one is incredibly disturbing. But before we get into it, just a quick reminder, this is a creepypasta, which means it's not real, it's just a fictional, made-up, scary story. So the story goes that in the late 1940s, Russian researchers decided they were going to conduct some kind of experiment using a gas-based stimulant no one had ever tested before. And the idea was to see how long they could keep certain test subjects awake. This was obviously pretty dangerous, controversial, it wasn't likely they'd find any willing participants, so they decided they were going to pick 5 political prisoners who were deemed enemies of the state during World War II and basically back them into a corner using their desire for freedom to manipulate them into doing this experiment. They basically said, if you agree to do this experiment and stay awake for 30 days, we will release you immediately afterward and you will be granted your freedom. So of course they said yes, they agreed to do the experiment, and the prisoners, who were now test subjects, were sealed inside this chamber where they would be closely monitored by researchers using microphones and then a couple porthole-sized windows that worked like two-way mirrors. The researchers could see in and monitor the subjects' oxygen levels, but the subjects could not see out. The first few days actually went pretty smoothly. The stimulant gas was being released at just the right level to keep them awake, keep them moving around. They were making casual small talk. But by day 4, their conversations started to get incredibly dark. They began discussing traumatic experiences from their past, and then by day 5, they were no longer talking to each other, just whispering into the microphones and window. They were paranoid, agitated, seemed to be plotting against one another, basically desperate to earn the researchers' trust in hopes of getting out early. But instead of stopping the experiment, the researchers just wrote it off as another side effect of the gas and kept going. Now on day 9, one of the subjects suddenly started screaming. He was running back and forth across the chamber, screaming at the top of his lungs for hours on end. It was so loud, so constant, that eventually his voice just gave out. He had screamed so loud for so long that he had torn his vocal cords. What was really disturbing was the other 4 subjects didn't react to his screaming at all. They didn't care, they just kept whispering to themselves. Not long after, subject 2 started screaming just like the first one had, but this time the response from the rest of the subjects was completely different. Instead of just sitting around whispering and ignoring it, the researchers watched as 2 of the other subjects began calmly tearing pages out of the books they'd been given. They smeared those pages in their own feces and then carefully pressed them over the glass windows, completely covering them. This completely blocked the researchers from seeing inside, and right after that, as soon as the window was covered, the screaming stopped, and so did the whispering. What followed was 3 days of total silence, not a single sound. It was so quiet that the researchers started checking the microphones every hour, convinced something must be wrong with the equipment. But everything was working fine, and the oxygen levels inside the chamber were normal, so whatever was happening in that chamber, the researchers had no way of seeing it, but they knew the subjects were still alive. On the morning of the 14th day, after several days of complete silence, the researchers decided that enough is enough. We're gonna do something that we previously agreed we wouldn't. They decided to use the intercom inside the chamber to provoke some kind of reaction or response. So they announced over the intercom that the chamber would be open to test the microphones and ordered the subjects to lie flat on their stomachs or else they'd get shot. But to make it a little bit more enticing, they added if they cooperated, one of the subjects would be released early and granted their freedom. Before they could even open the door, a calm voice came through the speaker for the first time in days. One of the subjects simply said, "We no longer want to be free." After that, the researchers couldn't get any more responses, so the decision was made to open the chamber at midnight on day 15. Now, in order to do this safely, they first flushed out the stimulant gas, replaced it with fresh air, and that alone triggered a response. The subjects began screaming, begging for the gas to be turned back on like they were begging for their lives. The researchers didn't listen, the chamber was unlocked, and a team of Russian soldiers rushed in to grab the subjects, but as soon as the soldiers stepped inside, they too began screaming at the absolute horror they found. This part's pretty messed up. Standing in about 4 inches of water were 4 of the 5 test subjects. The 5th subject was dead, and as the soldiers got closer to his body, they saw that chunks of flesh had been ripped from his thighs and chest. When they looked for the source of the flood, they saw that the drain in the center of the chamber had been blocked with some of those pieces of his flesh. But it wasn't just him. The remaining 4 subjects had ripped off huge chunks of their own skin and muscle so severely that you could actually see their organs through the wounds. They had even removed their abdominal organs, kept them intact, and laid them out on the floor like they were putting them on display. If that wasn't already disturbing enough, it got worse when the soldiers realized none of the food rations after day 5 had been touched because the subjects had been eating their own flesh. All of these wounds on their bodies were self-inflicted. They had been tearing their own flesh off. When the soldiers finally tried to get them out of the chamber, they were met with such violence that several of those soldiers died gruesome deaths, like one had his throat ripped out. During the struggle, one of the subjects ruptured his spleen and bled out almost instantly, but he kept fighting. Even after being injected with more than 10 times the normal dose of morphine, he broke a doctor's ribs and arm. His heart kept beating for 2 full minutes after he had no blood left, and even when it stopped, he kept screaming and thrashing for 3 more minutes, repeatedly saying more, begging for gas, until he finally went still. The remaining 3 were restrained, taken to a medical facility, and of course they begged to be given the gas, demanding to stay awake. Now, the subject who was the most injured was obviously taken to surgery first to have his organs he'd ripped out put back in, but sedatives and anesthesia didn't work. He fought hard, ripping through restraints despite being severely underweight until they finally managed to knock him out with anesthesia, but the moment his eyes closed, his heart stopped and he died. The subject, who couldn't speak due to his torn vocal cords, also violently refused anesthesia when it was his turn for surgery, so they decided to perform the full 6-hour procedure without it, and one of the nurses said he smiled at her during the surgery when their eyes met, like he enjoyed it. When it was over, he tried to speak. Obviously he couldn't, so the surgeon gave him a pen and some paper, and he wrote 2 words: keep cutting. The last subject was given the same surgery without anesthetic, but this time he was given a paralytic during the procedure because he wouldn't stop laughing as the surgeon operated. The paralytic wore off way too fast, and he started fighting the restraints again almost immediately. When asked why they had torn themselves apart and why they so desperately wanted the gas, they just kept repeating that they needed to stay awake. After surgery, all 3 were restrained and placed back in the chamber while the researchers and military argued about what they were going to do. The researchers just wanted to be done. They wanted the experiment to be over for good, so they honestly thought about just killing the subjects to sweep everything under the rug, but one of the commanding officers insisted they see what happens if they just restart the gas again. Despite objections from the researchers, the subjects were prepped for long-term confinement. They were hooked up to EEG monitors, given padded restraints, and as soon as they were told the gas was coming back, they stopped fighting. As they waited for the chamber to be sealed, they had to keep their minds busy so they didn't fall asleep. One of them was humming, the other was focusing on their restraints, but the third one kept blinking rapidly, and that's when the researchers noticed something incredibly strange. His brainwaves kept flatlining like he was experiencing sudden brain death before immediately returning to normal. As they watched the monitor trying to figure out what was going on, a nurse saw him close his eyes. At that moment, his brainwaves went into a deep sleep state before completely flatlining at the same time his heart stopped. This all happened the moment he fell asleep. The last subject, who could still speak, began screaming and begging to be sealed into the chamber, so the commander gave the go-ahead and ordered the last 2 subjects to be sealed back in with 3 of the researchers. But before the door closed, one researcher just snapped. He pulled out his gun, shot the commander, then turned to the subject who couldn't speak, shot him, killing him instantly, and then turned to the last subject, demanding to know what he was. That's when the subject smiled and quietly explained that he was a reflection of them all. The madness buried deep inside them, the thing they tried to silence when they sleep. The researcher aimed and fired, killing the last and final subject. That was the Russian sleep experiment. That one was heavy. This has been around since it was published in 2010 by an author known only as Orange Soda. It has circulated the internet for years. Like I said at the beginning of the video, this was just a creepypasta, which means it didn't happen. It's not real. It's a fictional, scary story. I definitely suggest going and reading the entire creepypasta on your own. I didn't read it word for word. I basically just retold you what happened. In July of 2019, 10-year-old Talia Forrest was riding her bike with a friend when her life was taken by a drunk driver. That driver, Colin Tweedy, did not stop when he hit Talia. He kept driving, went home, and later lied to police, blaming the entire thing on his girlfriend. And yet, despite all of that, he was just granted parole after serving less than a year of his sentence. To understand why the decision is so unbelievably wrong, you need to know what happened that night and what Talia's family has had to go through ever since. On July 11, 2019, Talia was spending the night at her best friend's house in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. After a full day at the beach and playing outside, the girls decided to take one last bike ride just up to the community mailboxes and back. It was just after 9:20 p.m. when the girls hopped on their bike, but I need you to remember that this was during the summer, which means the sun doesn't set until later in the evening, so at this point, there was still plenty of light, visibility was good, and that's very important because it comes up later. Now, the girls were riding on Black Rock Road, which is rural, but it's not remote. There are homes on both sides of the street, there are street lights, and kids often play or ride their bikes around there. There's even this slow down children at play sign nearby. After reaching the mailboxes and deciding that it was probably time to start heading back home, the girls stopped and waited patiently to cross the other side of the road. A neighbor who was actually out for a drive saw them standing there waiting. He noticed their bikes, he saw the reflectors, he even stopped his car to let them cross safely before pulling into his driveway and going inside. Not long after they crossed the road and continued riding back home, Talia's friend saw an SUV swerving all over the road, crossing the yellow line into their lane over and over again. She had a very bad feeling about this and told Talia, who was riding just behind her, that they should stop and wait for it to pass, and they did. But just seconds later, there was a loud noise, and when she looked back, Talia was gone. All she could see was her pink bike stuck under the SUV, being dragged down the road for over a kilometer before turning off onto another road. Her friend's screams caught the attention of a woman named Noelle, who stepped outside and immediately dialed 911 after the little girl told her that her best friend had just been hit by a car and she thought she was dead. When Talia's friend and her mom returned to the scene, they were met with debris scattered across the road, and inside the ditch there was a pair of black flip-flops, the front tire from Talia's bike, and a piece of plastic that was clearly from a vehicle. Still on the phone with 911, Noelle and several others began searching the area, calling out Talia's name, but they couldn't find her. It wasn't until the 911 operator actually instructed Noelle to walk down the road in the direction the SUV had gone that she finally found Talia lying motionless in a neighbor's yard. That moment, hearing that Talia had just been found, her friend's mom rushed over, checked for a pulse, and when she couldn't find one, she began performing CPR until paramedics arrived. Talia was rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately, she passed away at the scene. This was an incredibly horrific incident. Talia had suffered multiple fatal injuries from the impact. Even though this was a hit and run, it actually didn't take long for police to find the driver of the SUV. SUV. A woman named Leah came forward right at the scene and told RCMP officers that she believed the person responsible was Colin Tweedy. She gave them his name, his address, and explained exactly why she suspected him. Leah actually knew Colin. Her boyfriend at the time, Dave, was friends with him, and Leah was best friends with Colin's girlfriend, Beth. She'd seen Colin earlier that evening at her place. He was drinking beer and playing darts with Dave, and not long after Colin left their house in a Nissan Xterra SUV, they started hearing emergency sirens nearby. After hearing those sirens, Leah told Dave, who was a volunteer firefighter, to check his pager, and that's how they found out that a child had been hit by a car, so they rushed to the scene to offer assistance. They knew that the scene of this crash was along the route Colin had to take to get back home, so on the way there, Leah tried calling Colin twice, but the first time there was no answer. The second time, his girlfriend Beth picked up the phone and confirmed that Colin had made it home. At first, Leah felt relieved, but once she learned that it was actually a hit and run, she called Beth back and asked directly if Colin was involved. She told Beth that the police would be able to figure out whose vehicle it was just based on the debris that was in the road. She then hung up the phone and gave Colin's name and address to the RCMP officers. When the officers got to Colin's house, they found the Nissan Xterra parked out front, and the front end was very badly damaged. Both airbags had been deployed, and there was a strong smell of gasoline. Eventually, Colin and Beth came walking down the driveway, and one of the officers immediately recognized them because he had just seen them walking towards the crash site. Now, Colin claimed he thought he hit a deer and said they were going back to check and see if it was still alive, but in that moment, as he spoke, two of the officers noticed that he smelled very strongly of alcohol. He was slurring his words, swaying back and forth, very clearly intoxicated. In the Nissan Xterra, which belonged to Beth, officers found beer cans, and on the bumper, they found reddish smears and pink paint transfer that matched Talia's bike. At that time, both Colin and Beth were arrested and taken in for questioning. Colin agreed to a breathalyzer, but the problem with that is by the time officers actually breathalyzed him, it had been 4 hours since the crash, which is a lot of time. The first 3 tests, which were performed at 1:31 a.m., only came back with one conclusive result showing Colin's blood alcohol content was 0.07, and then another taken 20 minutes later showed 0.06. Colin would only admit to having about 4 or 5 beers between 2 and 9:30 p.m., but when a forensic alcohol expert reviewed the timeline and his breathalyzer results, they concluded his blood alcohol content at the time of the crash was likely between 0.102 and 0.143, well over Canada's legal limit of 0.08. But Colin wouldn't admit to driving. He lied to police for hours, claiming it was his girlfriend Beth behind the wheel. Officers told him they'd already spoken to her, she said it was Colin, and they let her go. Eventually, he admitted that he was the one driving, but even then, he stuck with the deer story, saying that's what he thought he hit because he'd seen some in the area a few weeks earlier. He said he didn't stop because he was afraid the car would break down and leave him stranded in the middle of the road. Now, despite his excuse, the evidence told a very different story. The front end of the SUV Colin drove that night was swabbed for DNA, and it came back as a match for Talia. They had an accident reconstructionist come in who confirmed that Colin was most likely impaired at the time of the crash and crossed the yellow line into the wrong lane. There were no brake marks. He didn't stop. He just kept driving, dragging Talia's bike for over a kilometer, causing sparks to fly up from under the SUV. How did he not notice that? I don't know. Colin was charged with dangerous and impaired driving causing death, failure to stop, and obstruction of justice for lying about who was behind the wheel. 2 days into his first trial, he pled guilty to obstruction, admitting he lied and that he was driving. His defense argued that the road was dark, full of potholes, and in bad condition, but none of that was true. The exact stretch of road where the girls had been riding was in good shape, and multiple neighbors testified to that. It wasn't even fully dark yet, it was dusk, and there were street lights. And if you remember, there was that neighbor who stopped his car and allowed the girls to cross the road safely minutes before the crash. The girls were very clearly visible. But even with all the evidence against him, Judge Mona Lynch acquitted him on every charge related to Talia's death, as well as failing to stop at the scene. She claimed there wasn't enough proof he was reckless or impaired, and made several statements that just weren't true. She said the road was dark, that the conditions were bad, and speculated without any evidence to back her up that Colin swerved to avoid potholes. Colin was only given 18 months of probation for that obstruction charge he pled guilty, but other than that, that was it. In 2023, the Nova Scotia Court of Appeals ruled that the decision to acquit Colin was legally flawed. They pointed out that Judge Lynch failed to consider key evidence like Colin's blood alcohol level within 2 hours of the crash, which is what Canadian law actually requires. She also ignored the question of whether Colin was willfully blind, meaning he chose not to stop just so he didn't have to learn the truth of who or what he had actually hit. The Court of Appeal also said that Judge Lynch didn't properly weigh the evidence around visibility, lighting, or his impairment, and ruled that because of that, Colin had to stand trial again. So in 2024, Colin was sent back to trial. After 6 days of the trial, the verdict came back guilty on all charges. Colin Tweedy was finally found guilty of impaired driving causing death, dangerous driving causing death, and failing to stop after an accident. It was ruled that Colin hit Talia causing her death because he was impaired, not because of potholes or poor lighting. And it was ruled that he was willfully blind. He made the decision not to stop. Despite the airbags going off, the damage to the SUV, the sparks from the dragging bike, he just kept driving. He was sentenced to 4.5 years in federal prison, but just this month, he was granted parole after serving less than a year of his sentence. Because the parole board says he doesn't live a criminal lifestyle and they are satisfied he will not drink again, which doesn't matter. He took a life. What's so deeply upsetting and something I really want to emphasize here is how long Talia's family has had to fight for justice. Her cousin Haylin, who runs the Justice for Talia TikTok page, told
told reporters after the second trial that their family's wait for justice was longer than Collins' entire sentence, and that really stuck with me because it's true.